The concert hall stood in the heart of the city like a monument to centuries of musical tradition. Its marble columns rose high above the bustling streets, and its grand doors welcomed thousands of music lovers each season. Inside those hallowed walls, the greatest musicians in the world had performed, their names etched into history alongside the building itself. But on most days, when the audiences had gone home and the lights dimmed, the hall belonged to a different kind of people entirely. Miguel Santos had worked as a janitor at the Thornton Symphony Hall for nearly 12 years. Every night after the concerts ended, he would arrive with his cleaning cart, his worn work boots echoing through the empty corridors. He mopped the marble floors that reflected the crystal chandeliers above. He polished the brass railings that lined the velvet-covered seats. He emptied trash bins filled with discarded programs and collected champagne glasses left behind by patrons in the luxury boxes. The work was honest and necessary, though it often went unnoticed by those who came to experience the magic of live music. Miguel had grown up in a small village in rural Mexico, where music was something that happened at festivals and family gatherings, played on guitars and accordions by men who had learned by ear. He had never imagined he would spend his adult life in a place where music was treated as high art, where people dressed in their finest clothes and paid hundreds of dollars to sit in cushioned seats and listen to sounds created by instruments he could barely name. But life had brought him here to this new country, and he was grateful for the work. It allowed him to provide for his family, to send his son to good schools, to give the boy opportunities he himself had never known. His son Daniel was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. The boy was quiet by nature, more comfortable observing than speaking. He struggled in some of his classes at school, particularly with reading, and Miguel worried sometimes that his son might fall behind. But there was something special about Daniel that Miguel had noticed early on. Whenever music played, whether from a radio, a television, or even a phone, the boy would stop whatever he was doing and listen with complete attention. His whole body would become still, and his eyes would focus on some distant point as though he could see the notes themselves dancing in the air. Most evenings, Miguel had no choice but to bring Daniel to work with him. His wife Rosa worked the night shift at a hospital, and they could not afford childcare. So Daniel would come along, carrying his backpack with homework he rarely completed, and he would sit quietly in the back rows of the concert hall while his father worked. Miguel had strict rules about this arrangement. Daniel was to remain silent, to stay out of the way, and above all, to never touch anything. The boy was good about following these rules. He would sit with his homework spread on the seat beside him, occasionally glancing up at the magnificent stage where hours earlier, musicians had created sounds that seemed to come from another world. The orchestra that called Thornton Hall its home was one of the finest in the country. Under the direction of Maestro Alexander Hoffman, they had won international acclaim and performed in the great halls of Europe and Asia. Hoffman himself was a legend in the classical music world, a man whose interpretations of the great composers were studied by musicians everywhere. He was known for his exacting standards, his fierce dedication to perfection, and his ability to draw extraordinary performances from every member of his orchestra. He was also known for his temper, which could flare when things did not meet his expectations. During the day, when Daniel was in school, the orchestra would rehearse. Miguel would sometimes hear them as he worked in other parts of the building, the sounds floating through the ventilation systems and hallways. The music was unlike anything he had heard growing up, complex and layered, sometimes gentle as a whisper, sometimes powerful enough to shake the walls. He did not always understand it, but he respected the skill and discipline required to create it. Daniel, however, seemed to understand it in a way that Miguel could not explain. On the evenings when they arrived early, before the night cleaning crew officially started their shifts, they would sometimes catch the final minutes of a rehearsal. Miguel would work quietly in the back, and Daniel would watch from the shadows, his small frame barely visible in the dimly lit seats. The boy never made a sound during these moments, but Miguel could see the concentration on his face, the way his fingers would move slightly as though tracing invisible patterns. One evening in late November, something changed. The orchestra had been rehearsing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, preparing for a major performance scheduled for the following week. The piece required a piano soloist, and the hall's magnificent Steinway grand piano had been wheeled onto the stage. Miguel and Daniel had arrived just as the rehearsal was ending. They waited in the back as always, while Maestro Hoffman gave final notes to his musicians. The orchestra members began packing up their instruments, and within 20 minutes the hall was empty except for the night cleaning crew beginning to trickle in. Miguel began his usual routine that evening, starting with the lobby areas where patrons had gathered during the intermission of the rehearsal. Daniel followed him as he sometimes did, helping to collect programs that had been left on benches and windowsills. The boy was unusually quiet, even for him, and Miguel noticed that he kept glancing back toward the main hall where the stage remained lit by the lights the crew used during cleaning. After about 30 minutes, Miguel told Daniel to go sit in his usual spot while he worked on the upper balconies. The boy nodded and walked back into the main hall, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet that ran down the center aisle. Miguel watched him go, then headed up the curved staircase with his supplies, planning to work his way down from the top tier of seating. Daniel entered the vast hall and stood for a moment, looking at the empty stage. The piano sat there like a sleeping giant, its black lacquered surface gleaming under the lights. The lid was open, propped up on its stick, revealing the strings and hammers inside. The boy had seen this piano many times before, but always from a distance, always with musicians surrounding it, always with the understanding that it was something precious and untouchable. He walked slowly down the aisle, his eyes never leaving the instrument. When he reached the front row, he stopped and stood there, gripping the back of a seat. From this distance, he could see the keys clearly, could see how they were arranged in patterns of black and white. He had watched pianists sit at this bench, had watched their hands move across those keys with speed and precision that seemed impossible. He had heard the sounds they created, sounds that made something deep inside his chest feel both happy and sad at the same time. Daniel looked around. The hall was empty. He could hear his father's footsteps on the floor above, could hear the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner starting up somewhere in the building. No one was watching. No one would know. He climbed the steps at the side of the stage, his heart beating fast. His father had told him never to touch anything, and he had always obeyed. But something was pulling him forward, something he could not name or resist. He approached the piano bench and stood beside it, barely tall enough to see over the keyboard. The bench was too high for him to sit properly, so he climbed onto it and knelt there instead, his knees on the cushioned seat. He looked down at the keys, his hands hovering above them. Then very gently he pressed down on one white key near the middle. The note rang out, clear and pure, filling the empty hall with sound. Daniel caught his breath, amazed that such a beautiful tone could come from such a simple action. He pressed another key, then another, listening to each note as it bloomed and faded. Then something extraordinary happened. His right hand found a pattern, a simple melody he had heard during the rehearsal earlier. He did not know he had memorized it. He did not know his fingers could find these specific keys without being taught. But somehow they did. The melody emerged from the piano, halting and uncertain at first, but recognizable. It was a fragment from the Rachmaninoff concerto, just a few measures of the opening theme. Daniel's left hand joined his right, finding lower notes that seemed to support the melody, though he had no understanding of harmony or chord structure. He was simply following what his ear told him, playing what felt right. The music grew more confident as his fingers learned the shapes and distances. He made mistakes, struck wrong notes, but he kept going, finding his way back to the melody each time. He did not hear the footsteps behind him. He did not see the figure that had emerged from the wings of the stage, drawn by the unexpected sound of the piano. He did not know that Maestro Alexander Hoffman had returned to the hall, having forgotten his reading glasses on the podium. Hoffman had been walking toward the podium when he heard the first notes. He stopped, confused. The rehearsal was over, the orchestra had left. Who could be playing? He moved quietly toward the piano, expecting to find one of his musicians, perhaps practicing a difficult passage. But when he came around the curved side of the grand piano, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. A small boy knelt on the bench, his back straight, his hands moving across the keys with a combination of awkwardness and surprising accuracy. The child was playing the opening theme of the Rachmaninoff, a piece that professional pianists spent years mastering. The boy's technique was non-existent. His hand position was all wrong. His posture would make any piano teacher cringe. But he was finding the notes, capturing the essence of the melody, and doing so with a focus that suggested he had forgotten the world around him. Hoffman stood absolutely still, barely breathing. His first instinct was to call out, to stop this unauthorized use of the hall's precious piano. But something held him back. He had spent 40 years in the world of music, had worked with prodigies and virtuosos, had witnessed extraordinary talent in many forms. What he was seeing now was different from technical skill or trained ability. This was something raw and unexplainable, like watching someone speak a language they had never been taught. The boy finished the phrase he was playing and paused, his hands hovering over the keys. Then he started again from the beginning, and this time he played it more smoothly, as though his fingers had learned from their first attempt. Hoffman's trained ear caught every mistake, every wrong note, every break in rhythm, but he also heard something else. He heard musicality, he heard feeling. He heard a child who understood on some instinctive level what the composer had meant to express. Miguel had finished cleaning the upper balcony and was making his way down to the mezzanine level when he heard it. The sound of the piano drifted up through the hall, faint but unmistakable. His first thought was that someone from the orchestra had returned for extra practice, but as he listened more carefully, something about the playing sounded wrong. The notes were uncertain, the rhythm uneven. Then a cold panic seized his chest. He knew that touch, that hesitancy. He knew exactly who was at that piano. He abandoned his cleaning cart and ran down the stairs, his heart pounding. All he could think about was his job, the rules he had violated by bringing his son here, the trust he had broken. When he burst into the main hall, he saw Daniel at the piano and a tall figure standing beside it. Miguel recognized Maestro Halted immediately. Everyone who worked at the hall knew the maestro by sight. Miguel rushed down the aisle, calling out in a mixture of English and Spanish. "I am so sorry, Maestro. Daniel, get down from there right now. I am so very sorry." His voice cracked with fear and embarrassment. He climbed onto the stage, reaching for his son. Hoffman raised one hand, a gesture that stopped Miguel in his tracks. "Wait," the maestro said quietly. His voice carried authority even at low volume. "How long has the boy been able to play?" Miguel stood frozen, his hand still outstretched toward Daniel. The boy had turned on the bench, his eyes wide, tears already forming as he realized what he had done. "He cannot play, sir," Miguel said, his accent thickening with stress. "He has never touched a piano before. I told him never to touch anything. This is my fault. Please, I will make sure it never happens again." Hoffman looked at Miguel, then back at Daniel. "He has never had lessons, never touched a piano." The maestro's voice held disbelief. "Never, sir, I swear to you. We cannot afford such things. I did not even know he was here. I was cleaning upstairs." Miguel was pleading now, terrified of losing the job that fed his family. The maestro walked slowly around the piano, studying Daniel's face. The boy sat very still, his small hands now in his lap, his head down. "Look at me, child," Hoffman said, his voice softer now. Daniel slowly raised his eyes. "What is your name?" "Daniel Santos," the boy whispered. "And where did you learn to play what you just played, Daniel Santos?" "I heard you practicing it," Daniel said quietly, "earlier today when we came in. You heard it once this afternoon and now you can play it." Daniel shrugged slightly, a gesture that seemed to say he did not understand it himself. "I just remember how it sounds, and then my fingers try to find it." Hoffman was silent for a long moment. Miguel watched the maestro's face, trying to read what would happen next, whether he would call security, whether this would be the end of everything. But the expression on Hoffman's face was not anger. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like wonder. "Play it again," Hoffman said, "the part you were just playing from the beginning." Daniel looked at his father, uncertainty in his eyes. Miguel did not know what to do. He wanted to grab his son and run, to apologize and disappear. But the maestro was waiting, and there was something in his manner that suggested this was not a request to be refused. "It is okay," Miguel said softly to his son in Spanish. "Play for the maestro." Daniel turned back to the piano and placed his hands on the keys. He took a breath and began again. This time with both men watching, his nervousness showed in the first few notes. But as the melody developed, he seemed to forget they were there. His body relaxed and the music came more freely. He played perhaps 30 seconds worth of the piece, the main theme and part of what followed, before his memory failed and his hands stopped. Hoffman stood completely still until the last note faded. Then he walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on it, his legs dangling over the side. He was quiet for so long that Miguel began to panic again, wondering what judgment was forming in the maestro's mind. Finally, Hoffman spoke, directing his words to Miguel. "Your son has something that cannot be taught. I have worked with hundreds of musicians, dozens of genuine talents. What I just witnessed is different. It is raw, completely untrained, but it is real." He paused, looking back at Daniel. "The question is what we do about it." "Sir, I do not understand," Miguel said carefully. Hoffman stood up and faced Miguel directly. "Your son needs training, proper training. He needs to study with someone who can develop what he has before it gets buried under the wrong habits." He gestured at the piano. "Playing like that by ear with no technique, it is remarkable now while he is young. But without guidance, he will hit a ceiling. He needs to learn to read music, to understand theory, to build proper technique." "We cannot afford piano lessons," Miguel said quietly, shame coloring his voice. "I am just a janitor, maestro. My wife works at the hospital. We have enough for food and rent, but not for such things." "I am not asking you to pay," Hoffman said. "I am offering to teach him myself." The words hung in the air between them. Miguel stared at the maestro, certain he had misunderstood. Hoffman was one of the most famous conductors in the world. He did not give piano lessons to the children of janitors. "I have not taught a private student in 20 years, Hoffman continued, "but I will make an exception. Twice a week, 1 hour each time, here after your rehearsals end. Bring him with you when you come to work." He looked at Daniel again, and something like a smile crossed his usually stern face. That is, if the boy wants to learn. Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with something Miguel had never seen before. It was hope pure and bright. The lessons began the following week. Miguel would bring Daniel to the hall every Tuesday and Thursday evening, arriving an hour before his shift officially started. Hoffman would be waiting at the piano, and for the next 60 minutes, the maestro would guide the boy through scales, exercises, and basic music theory. At first, Daniel struggled with reading notation. The symbols on the page seemed to confuse him in the same way that words on a page did at school. But when Hoffman played something for him to hear, the boy could reproduce it almost instantly. Hoffman adjusted his teaching method, using Daniel's extraordinary ear as a bridge to understanding. He would play a scale and explain its structure while Daniel listened, then have the boy play it back while looking at the written notes. Slowly, the connection formed between what Daniel heard, what his fingers did, and what the symbols meant. It was unlike any teaching experience Hoffman had ever had, but he found himself drawn into the process with an enthusiasm he had not felt in years. Word of the arrangement spread quietly through the orchestra. Some musicians were skeptical, wondering why the maestro was spending time on a child with no background or pedigree. Others were curious and would sometimes stay after rehearsals to listen from the wings. What they heard, week after week, was progress that seemed to defy normal learning curves. Within 3 months, Daniel was playing simple pieces with both hands. Within 6 months, he was working on intermediate classical compositions. Miguel watched his son transform. The quiet boy who had struggled in school began to gain confidence. His teachers reported that his reading was improving, that he was more engaged in class. At home, Daniel would hum the pieces he was learning, his fingers moving on invisible keys as he lay in bed at night. Rosa would sometimes cry quietly when she heard him practice on the old electronic keyboard Hoffman had arranged to be donated to their family. She had grown up poor as well, and seeing her son receive such an opportunity felt like a miracle. Hoffman saw something else developing in Daniel beyond technical skill. The boy had an unusual maturity in his musical interpretation. When he played slow movements, there was a depth of feeling that seemed beyond his years. When he played fast, energetic pieces, there was a joy that was infectious. The maestro began to believe that this child, given time and continued training, could become something truly special. 18 months after that first evening at the piano, Hoffman made a decision. The orchestra was preparing for its annual spring gala, a major fundraising event attended by donors and city officials. The program would include pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and Rachmaninoff. Hoffman called Miguel into his office one afternoon and told him that he wanted Daniel to perform at the gala. Not a full concerto, but a short solo piece between the orchestral works, just 5 minutes on stage. Miguel was terrified. Daniel was still just a child, barely 10 years old, and this would be in front of hundreds of people. But Hoffman was insistent. "He is ready," the maestro said. "And more importantly, he needs to experience what it means to share music with an audience. That is part of his education too." Daniel chose to play a Chopin nocturne, one of the pieces he had been working on for months. In the weeks leading up to the gala, Hoffman helped him refine every phrase, every dynamic, every subtle shift in tempo. They discussed what the music meant, what story it told, how to communicate feeling through sound. Daniel absorbed it all with the same natural instinct that had allowed him to play by ear that first night. The evening of the gala arrived. Miguel and Rosa sat in the audience, both dressed in clothes they had borrowed from friends. They had never attended a concert as guests before, and the experience of sitting in the plush seats instead of cleaning around them felt surreal. Around them sat wealthy patrons in expensive suits and gowns, people from a world entirely different from their own. When it came time for Daniel's performance, Hoffman himself walked onto the stage to introduce the boy. He told the audience about finding a janitor's son at the piano 18 months earlier, about recognizing something that could not be taught or bought, only nurtured. He spoke about what it meant to give opportunities to those who might otherwise never receive them. Then he invited Daniel to the stage. The boy walked out in a borrowed suit that was slightly too large for him. He looked impossibly small as he approached the grand piano. Miguel gripped Rosa's hand so tightly that she whispered for him to ease up. Daniel sat at the bench, adjusted his position, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment there was absolute silence in the hall. Then Daniel began to play. The nocturne flowed from the piano like water, each note perfectly placed, each phrase shaped with sensitivity and understanding. Daniel's small hands moved across the keys with a grace that 18 months of training had developed, but the feeling in his playing came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that Hoffman had recognized that first night and had worked so carefully to preserve while building technique around it. In the audience, Miguel felt tears streaming down his face. He thought about all the nights he had mopped these floors, All the times he had felt invisible in this grand building, all the fears he had carried about giving his son a better life. He watched his boy at the piano, commanding the attention of hundreds of people, creating beauty that filled every corner of the magnificent hall. When Daniel played the final chord and the sound faded into silence, there was a pause before the applause began. Then it erupted, filling the hall with sound as powerful as the music had been. People rose to their feet. Daniel stood and bowed just as Hoffman had taught him. He looked out into the audience and found his parents, and for just a moment he smiled. Hoffman stood in the wings, watching. He had conducted orchestras in the greatest halls of the world, had received standing ovations from audiences of thousands. But in this moment, watching a janitor's son take his bow after 18 months of work, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt that music had done what it was supposed to do. It had found someone who needed it and had given that person a voice. Everything else, all the technique and training and performance, was just in service of that simple truth. The boy who had knelt at the piano in an empty hall had sat at those same keys before a full house and had made them listen. And they had heard not just notes and rhythms, but the sound of possibility itself. Rhythms, but the sound of possibility itself. The concert hall stood like a temple of music in the heart of Vienna, its ornate walls having witnessed nearly 2 centuries of the world's greatest performances. On a cold November evening in 1952, the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra was deep into rehearsals for their upcoming season. The air inside buzzed with the familiar sounds of musicians tuning their instruments, the occasional burst of laughter, and the shuffling of sheet music. Joseph Novak had worked as the head janitor at the concert hall for almost 15 years. He was a quiet man with calloused hands and a slight limp from an old war injury. Every evening after the musicians left, he would sweep the aisles, polish the wooden floors until they gleamed, and ensure that every corner of the magnificent building was spotless. His son, 8-year-old Anton, often accompanied him during these late-night cleaning sessions. Anton was a thin boy with dark hair that never seemed to stay combed and eyes that absorbed everything around him with intense curiosity. While his father worked, Anton would sit in the back row of the empty hall, swinging his legs and listening to the echoes of music that seemed to linger in the air long after the orchestra had departed. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine what it must be like to create such beautiful sounds. The boy had never touched a piano in his life. His family lived in a small apartment in the workers' district where such luxuries were unthinkable. His father's modest salary barely covered rent and food, leaving nothing for music lessons or instruments. Yet Anton possessed something that money could not buy: an extraordinary ear for music and a memory that captured every note, every rhythm, every nuance of the pieces he heard night after night from his perch in the shadows. On this particular evening, the orchestra was preparing for a performance of Beethoven's Piano Concerto No. 5, known as the Emperor Concerto. The renowned pianist who was scheduled to perform as soloist had been running through the piece with the orchestra for hours. Maestro Friedrich Steinberg, a formidable conductor with a white mane of hair and piercing blue eyes, was known for his perfectionism. He demanded excellence and settled for nothing less. As the rehearsal stretched into the late evening, the soloist's frustration became evident. He stumbled over a particularly difficult passage for the 3rd time, and Maestro Steinberg raised his hand sharply, bringing the orchestra to an abrupt halt. Heated words were exchanged. The pianist, exhausted and irritable, slammed his hands on the keys in frustration and stormed off the stage, declaring he needed a break. The maestro dismissed the orchestra for a 30-minute intermission. Musicians filed out to the lobby, some lighting cigarettes, others heading to the small cafe next door. The great hall fell silent except for the distant sound of footsteps and muffled conversation from the corridors. Joseph had been waiting in the wings with his cleaning cart, as he always did, ready to quickly sweep any debris from the stage during the break. Young Anton, as usual, was with him. The moment the musicians dispersed, Joseph wheeled his cart onto the stage and began his work, moving efficiently between the music stands and chairs. Anton wandered to the center of the stage, drawn by the magnificent grand piano that sat there like a sleeping giant. He had watched it from afar countless times but had never been this close. The polished black surface reflected the warm glow of the stage lights. Slowly, almost reverently, he approached the instrument. His father, busy collecting discarded sheet music from the floor, did not notice at first when Anton reached out and gently touched one of the white keys. The single note rang out, pure and clear, filling the empty hall with sound. Anton froze, then pressed another key, then another. His small fingers began to move across the keyboard, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as nothing short of miraculous. The boy's hands, which had never received a single lesson, began to play the opening movement of the Emperor Concerto. The same passage that had frustrated the professional soloist just minutes before flowed from Anton's fingers with crystalline clarity. His playing was not perfect in the technical sense, but there was something in it that transcended mere technique. There was feeling, understanding, and innate musicality that spoke directly to the soul. Joseph dropped his broom, his face turning pale as he rushed toward his son, terrified of what the consequences might be for touching the precious instrument. But before he could reach the piano, a voice from the back of the hall commanded, "Stop. Do not interrupt him." Maestro Steinberg had returned early from the break and had been standing in the shadows, listening. He walked slowly down the center aisle, his face a mask of concentration and wonder. Behind him, other musicians began to filter back in, drawn by the unexpected sound. They gathered silently, watching in amazement as this small boy in worn-out clothes continued to play. Sonnet 4. 5 extended. Anton remained unaware of the growing audience behind him. His eyes were closed, his entire being absorbed in the music that poured from his fingertips. The melody he produced was not merely a reproduction of what he had heard. It carried within it an emotional depth that seemed impossible for a child of his age to possess. Each phrase breathed with life, each transition flowed as naturally as a river finding its course. Maestro Steinberg reached the front of the stage and stood motionless, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression had transformed from initial surprise to something approaching awe. The other musicians gathered in clusters throughout the hall, some standing in the aisles, others leaning against the walls. The professional pianist who had stormed off earlier returned and stood frozen at the entrance, his anger forgotten as he witnessed what was unfolding before him. Joseph stood a few feet from the piano, his weathered face a mixture of fear and confusion. He had known his son loved music, had seen him sitting quietly during rehearsals, but this revelation struck him like a physical blow. Where had this come from? How was this possible? His mind raced with worry about what this intrusion might cost him. Would he lose his position? Would they be thrown out in disgrace? The boy played for nearly 10 minutes, working his way through the opening movement with remarkable accuracy. His small hands stretched to reach chords that seemed beyond their span, yet he managed to capture the essential character of Beethoven's magnificent composition. When he finally reached a natural stopping point, his hands fell still on the keys. The silence that followed was profound. Then Anton opened his eyes and seemed to wake from a dream. He looked down at his hands resting on the ivory keys as if seeing them for the first time. Slowly, he turned around and saw the assembly of people watching him. His face flushed crimson with embarrassment and fear. He scrambled off the piano bench, nearly knocking it over in his haste. Joseph rushed forward and grabbed his son by the shoulders, his voice trembling as he stammered an apology to the maestro. He promised it would never happen again, begged forgiveness for the intrusion, explained that the boy did not understand the impropriety of what he had done. His words tumbled out in a desperate rush, each sentence more pleading than the last. Maestro Steinberg raised his hand, silencing Joseph's frantic apologies. He descended the stairs at the side of the stage with measured steps and approached Anton, who shrank back against his father's side. The maestro knelt down so that his eyes were level with the boy's. For a long moment, he simply studied Anton's face, searching for something in those frightened young eyes. "How long have you been listening to us rehearse?" the maestro asked, his voice gentle but commanding. Anton's reply came in barely a whisper. "Since I was very small, sir, I come with my father every night." "And the piano you have studied somewhere?" The boy shook his head vigorously. "No, sir, I have never touched a piano before tonight. I only listened." A murmur rippled through the assembled musicians. The maestro's thick eyebrows rose in astonishment. He glanced at Joseph, who nodded confirmation of his son's words, still too frightened to speak properly. "You learned this by listening alone?" The maestro's voice carried a note of incredulity. "Yes, sir. I hear the music and then I remember it. I can hear all the notes in my head, where they go, how they fit together." Maestro Steinberg stood up slowly, his knees cracking slightly with the effort. He turned to face the orchestra members who had gathered around. His face was unreadable as he considered what he had just witnessed. The silence stretched out, broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Finally, the maestro spoke, addressing the entire assembly. "In my 40 years of music, I have encountered prodigies, talented students, and dedicated professionals. What I have just witnessed defies all my experience." He turned back to Anton. "This child has never been taught, yet he plays with an understanding that many professionals lack. This is not simply mimicry. This is genuine musical intelligence." The professional pianist stepped forward from where he had been watching. His earlier frustration had vanished, replaced by genuine curiosity. "Maestro, if I may, perhaps we should test this further. Can the boy reproduce other pieces?" Steinberg nodded slowly. He asked Anton if he had listened to other works during the rehearsals. The boy nodded eagerly, his fear beginning to recede slightly. He rattled off a list of compositions he had heard over the past months, naming them with surprising accuracy even when he did not know the formal titles, describing them instead by their melodies and moods. The maestro gestured toward the piano. "Play something else for us, whatever you remember." Anton hesitated, looking up at his father for permission. Joseph, still overwhelmed by the unfolding situation, could only nod weakly. The boy returned to the piano bench, settling himself carefully. This time he was acutely aware of every eye upon him, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys. He chose a Mozart sonata that the orchestra had been practicing the previous week. His fingers found the opening notes, and once again, the music seemed to transport him beyond his nervousness. The piece emerged from the piano with clarity and grace, though his small hands occasionally struggled with the technical demands of the composition. What he lacked in technique, he compensated for with an intuitive sense of phrasing and dynamics that left the professional musicians shaking their heads in wonder. When he finished, spontaneous applause broke out among the orchestra members. Several of them approached the stage, eager to speak with the remarkable child. The concertmaster, an elderly violinist named Hermann who had played with the orchestra for 30 years, wiped tears from his eyes openly. Maestro Steinberg raised his hands, calling for quiet. He turned to Joseph, who stood awkwardly at the edge of the stage, still clutching his broom handle as if it were a lifeline. "Mr. Novik, your son possesses a rare and precious gift. It would be a crime against music itself to allow such talent to go undeveloped." Joseph's voice shook as he replied, "Maestro, I am just a janitor. I have no money for teachers or lessons. What you suggest is impossible for people like us." The maestro's stern expression softened slightly. "I am not suggesting that you pay for his education. I am telling you that the world of music has an obligation to this child." He paused, considering his words carefully. "I know several teachers in Vienna who would consider it an honor to work with such a student. I will personally ensure that Anton receives proper instruction without cost to your family." The murmurs of agreement from the assembled musicians grew louder. The professional pianist stepped forward and offered to provide preliminary lessons himself until a permanent arrangement could be made. Others volunteered to donate their old sheet music to help find a practice instrument to assist in whatever way they could. Joseph's eyes filled with tears. The weight of years spent in poverty, of dreams deferred and opportunities denied, suddenly seemed to lift from his shoulders. Yet a new fear replaced it. "But sir, what if he fails? What if this is just a moment and nothing more?" Steinberg placed a firm hand on Joseph's shoulder. "Listen to your son play and tell me if you truly believe this is just a moment. This child does not simply have talent, he has genius, and genius once discovered demands to be nurtured." Over the following weeks, Anton's life transformed completely. A wealthy patron of the orchestra, moved by the story of the janitor's son, donated an upright piano that was installed in the Novik family's small apartment. The neighbors complained about the noise at first, but soon they too became enchanted by the music that flowed from the modest dwelling at all hours. True to his word, Maestro Steinberg arranged for Anton to study with Professor Karl Richter, one of Vienna's most respected piano teachers. Richter, initially skeptical of the maestro's glowing reports, became one of Anton's most devoted advocates after their first lesson. He declared that teaching Anton was not like instructing a beginner, but rather like awakening someone who already understood music in their bones. Anton proved to be a dedicated student, practicing for hours each day with a focus that amazed his teacher. Yet he never forgot where he came from. Each evening, he still accompanied his father to the concert hall, though now he came not just to listen but sometimes to practice on the grand piano during breaks in rehearsals, always with permission. Joseph continued his work as a janitor, refusing offers of other employment. He took pride in his work and saw no shame in it. But now, as he swept the floors and polished the wood, he did so with his head held higher, knowing that his son would have opportunities he himself had never dreamed possible. The story of the janitor's son who played piano by ear spread throughout Vienna's musical community. Within a year, Anton gave his first public recital to a packed hall. Within 5 years, he was performing as a soloist with major orchestras across Europe. But he never forgot that November evening when Maestro Steinberg halted the entire orchestra to listen, the moment when a small boy's secret gift was revealed to the world, transforming not just his own life, but touching everyone who witnessed the power of pure, undeniable talent breaking through the barriers of circumstance and class. The years that followed brought challenges that young Anton could never have anticipated. Natural talent, as he quickly discovered, was merely the foundation upon which a career in music had to be built. Professor Richter pushed him relentlessly, demanding technical precision to match his innate musicality. The exercises were tedious, the scales endless, the repetition of difficult passages sometimes seeming cruel to a boy who had initially played purely for joy. There were moments when Anton wanted to quit. His hands ached from hours of practice. His classmates at school mocked him for being different, for spending his afternoons at the piano while they played football in the streets. Some called him the charity case, the janitor's son who got lucky. The words stung more than he ever admitted to his father. Joseph watched his son struggle with a heavy heart. He had never wanted fame or recognition for Anton, only happiness. On difficult evenings, when he found his son slumped over the piano in frustration, he would sit beside him and speak quietly about choice and obligation. He told Anton that the gift he possessed came with no requirement to share it with the world. If the piano brought more pain than joy, they could stop. They could go back to their simple life. But Anton would shake his head, wipe his eyes, and return his fingers to the keys. Something deeper than ambition drove him forward. The music itself called to him in ways he could not explain. When he played, truly played, and lost himself in the composition, nothing else existed. Not the poverty, not the mockery, not the exhaustion. Only the pure truth of sound and emotion combining into something larger than himself. By the time Anton turned 14, he had won 3 major youth competitions and performed in concert halls across Austria and Germany. The critics praised his technical skill, but especially noted the emotional maturity of his interpretations. They remarked that he played like someone who had lived far longer than his years suggested, as if the music channeled experiences beyond his own limited lifetime. What the critics did not know was that Anton still accompanied his father to the concert hall several nights each week. While Joseph cleaned, Anton would sit in the empty auditorium and listen to the silence, remembering the echoes of music that had first awakened his gift. Sometimes he would play for his father alone, performing pieces he was learning or simply improvising melodies that came to him in the moment. These private concerts meant more to Joseph than any public performance. He would lean on his mop and watch his son, seeing not the rising star that Vienna celebrated but the small boy who had once sat in the back row, swinging his legs and dreaming. The bond between them remained unshakable, anchored by their shared understanding that success had not made them different people, only people with different opportunities. When Anton was 16, tragedy struck. Joseph suffered a severe heart attack while working late one evening. Anton found him collapsed backstage, his face gray and his breathing labored. The ambulance came quickly, but the damage was extensive. Joseph survived, but his working days were over. The concert hall administration offered him a small pension, supplemented by contributions from orchestra members who had grown to love the quiet janitor and his extraordinary son. The financial strain threatened everything. Anton's musical education was expensive despite the generosity of his teachers. Concert clothing, sheet music, travel to competitions and performances all required money that the family no longer had. Anton immediately began seeking paid performances, taking any opportunity to earn money regardless of the venue's prestige. Maestro Steinberg, now in his 70s and semi-retired, heard about the family's difficulties. He called Anton to his home one afternoon and spoke to him with characteristic bluntness. He explained that desperation was the enemy of artistry, that playing solely for money would corrupt the purity that made Anton special. Then he made a proposal. The maestro had connections throughout the European musical world. He would arrange a debut performance with the Vienna Philharmonic, a full concerto as a featured soloist. It would be Anton's coming out to the musical establishment, his transition from promising youth to serious artist. The fee for such a performance would solve the family's immediate financial crisis and open doors to future opportunities. But there was a condition. Anton must choose the program himself and prepare it without compromise. He must not play what was safe or crowd-pleasing, but what spoke most deeply to his artistic vision. The maestro wanted the world to hear not just a talented pianist, but a true musician with something meaningful to say. Anton chose the Emperor Concerto, the piece he had first played by ear that November evening 8 years earlier. It felt like returning home, like honoring the moment that had changed everything. He practiced obsessively, working with Professor Richter to refine every phrase, every dynamic shading, every subtle nuance of Beethoven's masterwork. Joseph, recovering slowly at home, listened to his son practice for hours each day. He heard the piece transform under Anton's hands, growing deeper and more powerful with each repetition. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what this performance represented. It was not just a concert but a statement of identity, a declaration that the janitor's son belonged on that stage not because of charity or sentiment, but because of genuine artistic merit. The night of the performance arrived cold and clear. The concert hall was sold out, filled with Vienna's musical elite alongside ordinary music lovers who had followed Anton's unlikely journey. In a box seat sat Joseph, pale but present, determined to witness his son's defining moment. Beside him sat Professor Richter, Maestro Steinberg, and several orchestra members who remembered that extraordinary evening when a small boy had first touched the piano. As Anton walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, he paused and looked up at his father. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment no words were necessary. Everything they had endured, every sacrifice and struggle had led to this. Every sacrifice and struggle had led to this. Anton settled himself at the piano, adjusting the bench with the careful precision he had learned from years of practice. The magnificent instrument gleamed under the stage lights, the same piano he had first touched 8 years ago with trembling, untrained fingers. Now his hands were strong and disciplined, shaped by countless hours of work, yet they still carried the same intuitive understanding that had astonished everyone that fateful evening. Maestro Steinberg, who had come out of retirement specifically for this performance, raised his baton. The orchestra sat poised, ready. In that suspended moment before the first note, Anton felt a peculiar calm settle over him. All the nervousness, all the pressure and expectation simply dissolved. He was no longer the janitor's son or the prodigy or the charity case. He was simply a musician about to share something beautiful with people who had gathered to listen. The opening chords rang out, bold and triumphant, exactly as Beethoven had intended. Anton's fingers moved across the keys with authority, claiming the music as his own. But this was not the hesitant exploration of a child playing by ear. This was the work of an artist who understood not just the notes, but their meaning, their context, their emotional architecture. From his seat, Joseph closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. He heard in Anton's playing everything their lives had been. The struggle was there in the powerful bass notes that anchored the composition. The hope was there in the soaring melodies that seemed to reach toward something beyond the ordinary world. The love was there in the gentle passages that spoke of connection and belonging. Professor Richter leaned forward in his seat, his trained ear catching every subtlety of Anton's interpretation. The boy had made bold choices, taking tempos slightly differently than traditional performances, emphasizing certain phrases in unexpected ways. Yet nothing felt arbitrary or showy. Every decision served the music's deeper truth. This was not merely technical excellence, though the technique was flawless. This was communication, honest and direct. The audience sat mesmerized as the concerto unfolded. In the slow movement, Anton's playing became almost conversational, as if the piano were speaking in a human voice about loss and beauty and the quiet strength required to endure. Several people in the audience found tears streaming down their faces without quite understanding why. The music had found something vulnerable in them and touched it gently. When the final movement arrived, Anton unleashed all the power and joy the composition demanded. His hands flew across the keyboard, executing impossibly rapid passages with crystalline clarity. The orchestra surged behind him, musicians playing with an intensity that matched his own. Maestro Steinberg conducted with eyes closed at times, a slight smile on his weathered face, lost in the glory of the moment. As the concerto built toward its conclusion, Anton felt himself lifted beyond technique and training. He was 8 years old again, hearing this music for the first time, feeling it enter his heart and take root there. But he was also 16, battle-tested and shaped by struggle, able to give back to the music everything it had given him. Past and present merged in the cascade of notes that filled the hall. The final chord struck with decisive force and then silence. For 3 full seconds the audience sat frozen, as if waking from a collective dream. Then the applause began, not the polite appreciation typical of concert halls but something wild and unrestrained. People rose to their feet shouting their approval. The ovation went on and on, wave after wave of recognition and joy. Anton stood and bowed, his face flushed with exertion and emotion. He gestured to the orchestra, sharing the triumph with them. He bowed to Maestro Steinberg, who nodded back with unmistakable pride. Then Anton looked up at the box where his father sat. Joseph was standing, tears running freely down his face, applauding with the kind of fierce pride that only a parent can feel. The concert hall administration presented Anton with an enormous bouquet of flowers. Photographers rushed forward to capture the moment. Critics scribbled furiously in their notebooks, already composing the reviews that would appear in tomorrow's papers. But Anton barely noticed any of it. He only wanted to get to his father. After what seemed like an eternity of bows and acknowledgments, Anton was finally released from the stage. He ran through the backstage corridors, still in his formal concert clothes, taking stairs 2 at a time. He burst into the box where Joseph waited and threw his arms around his father, not caring who saw or what they thought. Joseph held his son tightly, this remarkable young man who had somehow emerged from their simple, difficult life. He whispered into Anton's ear, Words that no one else heard, words of love and gratitude and wonder at the mysterious way the world sometimes worked. The newspapers the next morning were unanimous in their praise. They called Anton's performance a revelation, a triumph, the arrival of a major new talent on the international stage. Offers poured in from concert halls across Europe. Recording contracts were proposed. The future that had once seemed so uncertain now stretched before Anton bright with possibility. But success, when it finally came, did not change the things that mattered most. Anton continued to visit the concert hall where his father had worked, though now he came as a guest artist rather than a janitor's son. He never forgot the people who had believed in him when he was just a small boy with an impossible dream. He gave free concerts at schools in working-class neighborhoods, hoping to inspire other children who might think that music belonged only to the wealthy and educated. Joseph recovered enough to attend all of Anton's major performances. He would sit in the audience, often in simple seats rather than the honorary boxes offered to him, and listen with the same wonder he had felt that first night. He never fully understood how his son created such beauty, but he understood that it mattered, that it added something precious to the world. Years later, when Anton had become one of Europe's most celebrated pianists, he was asked in an interview about the moment that had launched his career. He spoke about the November evening when Maestro Steinberg had halted the orchestra to listen to an unknown child play. But he always emphasized that the true beginning had come earlier, in all those nights sitting in the back row of an empty concert hall, listening while his father worked, storing up music like treasure in his heart, waiting for the moment when he would finally have the chance to give it all back. Sonnet 4 or 5 Extended Claude is. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.